As Sally said, my name's Nick Jankel. I have just finished, and when I say just, I mean like this afternoon, not just. A book, my second book, called Spiritual Atheist. This is actually the proof copy that went out to the journalists, and one lucky person is going to leave here with this tonight. It was actually supposed to be published today, but we've postponed it for 2 weeks to just polish it off. It's a big book, spent 2 years writing it. And the book is basically a book that looks to find out a way to take the things that we think of as wisdom, as Sally's mentioned, and the things that we think of as science, and figure out how to understand how they fit together and how we can use them both equally in our life. The ultimate aim of the book is to come up with what the Greeks called a bios, and it's actually an important word, bio, as in biology, biography, life. For them, philosophy wasn't something that happens in a university, it was something that happens in life. And so this is a book about a life philosophy that I've been working on for now about 25 years, which seeks to help us thrive, help us deal with those ice blocks on our window, and all the other things that happen in life. Help us make decisions like, do we immunize our children? Big one for parents. Do we take the surgery offered to us or try something else? Do we take the pills offered to us or try something else? How do we invest our money? How do we think our government should invest our tax dollars? And what kind of evidence-based programs? These are all the questions that we all have to answer, whether we're individuals or leaders. And I also believe in personal leadership. We are all leaders in some way, in our systems, in our community, in our family. We all can be. But the book also seeks to go further and go, okay, well, if this is how we personally can live, maybe there's something missing from our modern world which could help us do what I've spent my life trying to do, and I'm still trying to do, which is recalibrate the world we're in. I think we've gone way too far towards an area of life around things to do with matter, material, metrics, money, things that are easy to measure, ultimately. I'll tell you a little bit about that in a minute. And I think we all feel, but don't always know how to articulate how to shift the world back to more balance, without just saying, hey man, it should all be about peace, love, and flower power, which kind of, we tried it in the 60s, we tried it again in the rave generation, and I don't believe that's exactly how the change we want to happen is going to happen. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my personal journey. The book is actually partly a memoir, and I didn't want to write a memoir. It's the last thing I could possibly imagine wanting to do is tell anyone my personal journey. But the book actually came to me in all the chapters, and I didn't change them at all. Only one added chapter came to me in one evening at a dinner. This guy asked me, what is this thing you do called wisdom teaching? He's a very religious person. And I was saying, well, it's about understanding spirit and consciousness and our own connection to this thing called the universe. And he was like, wow, and how did you get to it? So I ended up telling him about my science degree. He was like, how did you get from there to there? And I realized that just by some kind of twist of fate, my journey through the modern world allows me to say things about the world that, in a way that brings it to life. So I wrote it's a philosophical memoir, I call it, and I can tell you a little bit about those kind of the major beats in that life, so you can understand then a little bit of theory that I'm going to dump on you, hopefully elegantly caress you into some big thoughts before I finish up. Where's my timing? Good, here it is. Okay, so I'll give you a really 3-minute version of my life, and then I'm going to tell you some of the juice of what I think I've come to. So when I was 15 years old, I was asked to do a sermon in a synagogue in London to celebrate me coming fully into the Jewish faith. Before that, I'd had a bar mitzvah, but I'd never thought about what I was bar mitzvahing into. It was just like, here's some checks that are nice, cashing some checks, some presents. It's kind of fun, have a party, disco, girls. But when I was 15, it was like, now I had to do a sermon. I was chosen to do a sermon. So I went, okay, I need to really understand what the hell it is, this thing called religion. Looked really into it, decided it was not for me, that the rules it created and the scripture that it worked from and the rituals that it lived through were not nourishing to me. They didn't seem to be able to give me the answer to the questions I had, which is, why do I feel like an alien landed in this world? Why can't I get laid? Why do my parents seem to not want to live in the same house as each other? They got divorced when I was 2. So I decided to become an atheist. And I did it quite mindfully because I gave a sermon about how terrible idea religion is to about 300 religious people in a synagogue. Which, as I say in the book, I can't believe they allow me back in the place, but they do. Very tolerant, actually, the Jewish religion. So I became a militant atheist. I wasn't just an atheist, I was a militant atheist. I was reading Karl Marx, I became a socialist. I was reading Freud, and I became a kind of atheist, therapy, interested person. I did 3 years of therapy from 13 to 16. And I decided to become a scientist. Not just that, I decided to become a medic, and I decided to become a psychiatrist. That was my whole thing. So off I trundled to Cambridge, and as I say, I prayed at the altar of atheism, because Cambridge University is a place where you cannot say who thinks they're an old soul. That's going to be something that's not going to go down very well amongst 99.9% of the people that I studied with or learned from. After leaving medical school, I did philosophy, and I got really into ideas. Like, it was the first time in my life I'd ever been like blown away by what I was learning. Up to then, it was really interesting, oxytocin and dopamine and hearts and lungs. It was really interesting stuff. But it wasn't blowing my mind. Did philosophy, blew my mind, and I decided I got a job in advertising. Bizarrely, you might say, but it was actually a job that was designed to use psychology and philosophy to sell things. I just got into it, kind of interesting and fun and exciting, a bit glamorous, and I was good at it, and I enjoyed it. A couple of years into that, I was still getting into therapy because I was still pretty miserable, but I had a kind of, as we all do, a natural joie de vivre. And then I set up my own company, and we went from 2 people in a room to about 50 people in a room by the time I was about 29. So I was, on paper, a multimillionaire. I had a big team. We were flying all over the world. I had all the gold cards you could imagine. And on paper, in the material world, I had made it. I had my own house in London, flat, I should add, stuff, all the stuff you could want. But inside, I was hollowed out. I was overwhelmed by what I was doing. But what I realized in hindsight was my heart was being broken each day by what I was actually doing, how I was using my skills and talents. Because as the way I say it, I was using the transformational skills to find the bit of each person that's not okay, and to flick it and to say, you're not okay, but if you buy this thing, you will be okay. And that just was not my life's purpose. Inside, I was a mess, relationships tanking. I'd never really had a relationship that really worked. In terms of intimacy, lots of relationships, lots of fun, lots of excitement, lots of those whirlwind romances. But in terms of true vulnerability and intimacy, never. And I wanted it so much. But what I wanted most of all was inner peace. I'd been diagnosed at some point with clinical depression. I'd been on antidepressants. And it all came crumbling down one day, literally one crisis day. And crisis, by the way, is a turning point in Greek, not anything bad, just a turning point, an opportunity to shift direction. And I walked out my own business, and I never went back. I didn't get the exit that I was being hustled to get by our accountant who was teeing up a deal to sell. I didn't stick in the company. I just literally walked away and went inside because I realized I had crashed fully. It was kind of like burnout mixed with breakdown, and it wasn't pretty. But the great thing is it called me fully into attention to who I was and what I was doing. I was just about 30, and I went off on a bit of a decompressed tour, ended up starting up a social enterprise in the transformation space, which I do some version of 13 years later with my wife who's sitting here, called Switch On, by the way, and I could give you the URL later. And during that period, I went really deep. I've always had no truck with New Ageism. Not my thing. I remember being at parties in Camden Town in, I'm going to say, the late 80s when I was a young teenager, and being told about, you know, conspiracies and all this stuff. I was just like, this stuff is not my thing. And aesthetically, it's not my thing. I've always, you know, I was in advertising, denim and coolness was my, you know, my thing. So I had to go past all that. I had to go, you know what, I've got to go into the source of this stuff myself. I can't get turned off by the front cover of a book having dolphins on it. I've got to dive in. And I say that because if I could, where I was at, if I can go down that path, then anyone can. But I went deep, and I got trained in hypnotherapy. I started meditation. I did breath work. I just did so many interesting and awesome things. And during that period, I started to learn the most important thing I could ever learn or teach anyone, which is that in some unfathomable way, we are all connected. We are all one. We're all part of one thing, not two things or three things, one thing. And the one thing, we call it the universe, we call it Brahman, Buddhahood, brotherhood if you're a communist. Doesn't really matter what you call it. The important thing is that you find a way to experience it, because once you experience it, you can start to use it to heal yourself, to transform yourself, to get through all those fiery moments that come up in life, in a big life. Not just that, can you heal yourself, you actually then can start using it in your life as a leader, as a lover, as a parent, and you can bring this thing called consciousness, which is a very big word, into the everyday. So that was my big awakening. So I had a conversion to atheism, and I became converted to a fundamental, absolute, non-dual believer in the unity of everything. That's where most people would go, that's it, I've done my conversions, I'm happy, I'm going to join a chanting group on a Thursday night. All good. But I'm a philosopher, and I'm not happy knowing that there are like 5 different ways of speaking about the world. I wanted to have one way. Because ultimately, for me, if there's only one universe, then there has to be only one narrative of that universe, right? There has to be one accounting of that universe. But we're told that the scientific way of accounting and explaining the universe is totally fundamentally different from the religious way. And that's been a war that's been had for the last 200, 300, 400 years, really since Galileo got kicked out of the church for declaring that the planet was not being orbited by the sun. So I went back into history and go, well, what is this thing called science that I studied? What does it actually say, and what does it really mean? What can it say, what it can't say? And what about this spirituality thing, this consciousness, this meditation thing? What can it say and what can't it say? And cutting a very long story short, because I've only got 6 more minutes to tell you the answer, I realized that I went back to the history books, and I realized something very important, and it's one of the things that in the book that I make quite a big deal of. When the scientists started doing science back in the day, and Galileo was actually the first person to start talking about this in his writings, they realized that doing science about things that are quite experiential, perceptual, is really hard. Because I can say to that glass of red wine here, what does it taste like to you? And it tastes like one thing. And I say, what does it taste like to you? It tastes like something else. And it seems like some of the properties of the wine are not in the wine, they're in you. That makes doing science really hard. So they decided, back in the day, to cut through the world and say, okay, there's these things called primary properties. Mass, speed, density, the things you can measure with funky instruments. They've got funkier, clearly. We're going to call those primary properties. And science is going to study primary properties. And these other things called secondary qualities, we don't really know what they are. We don't know if they're in the thing or in the mind. And you know what? We're just not going to deal with them. That's one step. Okay, science focuses here. These things someone else has to deal with. Psychology tried to deal with them, also realized they were really hard to be scientific about them, so they just stopped doing them as well. But for about 100 years, until relatively recently. But what happened, I believe, is it wasn't what happened over time as atheism became a thing, and now we have this new atheism, this very militant atheism, which I used to believe in, is people went from one thing, which is there's these 2 different types of things, and we're just not going to be able to deal with one of them, to actually saying, you know what, those secondary qualities don't even exist. There's a quite famous philosopher of consciousness, materialist, scientist, atheist, who actually says that consciousness is an illusion, fully an illusion, given the fact that he writes his books through and within consciousness, right? So we've got to a point now where we have denigrated all forms of knowledge in the public space, not so much in the private space. In the public space, if you walk into a meeting and say, I've been channeling today some deep intuition, I'm feeling love gushing out in me, and I'm sensing that this billion-dollar project just isn't a good fit for us. Right. And that's the problem, because we need that insight in our decision making. We need it in government, we need it in business, we need it in politics. But because it's been associated with religion, it was cut away and said that's nothing to do with the state. Because we actually I don't want religious dogma in our government. I don't want old rules based upon someone in the desert 1,000 or 2,000 years ago getting in the way of what we actually do as a nation. Right? I believe in the separation of church and state. But the thing that we're missing is this thing called conscious awareness, which comes up as things like purpose, intuition, felt sense, this embodied sense that you have about something. Because that's the domain of the secondary qualities. And I discovered over the years that the best science we have of the secondary qualities is consciousness, is what the contemplative traditions. Whether it's what I call the cool contemplative traditions, so meditation mainly, or whether it's the hot ones, so ecstatic experiences, whether that's shamanic experiences, whether it's dancing crazily on a Wednesday night in Brighton until you no longer think, whether it's raving till 4 in the morning. These are all shamanic experiences. That one sort of heats away the ego, burns it away, one cools it down. Those sciences, that science, the contemplative science, has shown over millions of years that if, and I mean thousands of years, if you go inside and meditate for enough time, you will find the truth of yourself, that you are one with everything. It's a science. It's just not the Western kind of science. So what I've realized is we need to bring these two parts of the world back together. We're living in a world where the split between primary qualities and secondary qualities has not just disintegrated the world that we're in, and we're having populism and religious extremism all over again. We've got materialism and this focus on KPIs. But in ourselves, we have, I believe, within us a schism. A psychological schism between our love and what we feel, and our compassion and caring and intuition, and what our mind says is right, based upon reason and logic. And that's the reason why I believe depression is now the #1 burden on global health. Anxiety is the fastest growing problem for young people. Suicide kills more than war and murder put together every year. Because I believe we have lost the ability to merge these two parts of ourselves together. So my book basically tells that story and a lot more about how that then affects the mind-body problem, the hard problem of consciousness, the placebo effect, all these things that we can't understand when we just understand primary properties from science. And I've got a little visual aid here as I finish up, which, oh, here it is. So in science, there's actually a wonderful object called a Mobius strip. Anyone know what a Mobius strip is? Anyone see one? So the best way I can turn this idea of these two parts of reality together is the Mobius strip. So just to summarize, I believe that science is the best way we have discovered to create certain knowledge about things that we gaze at through our eyes in this outside world that we can measure. Conscious studies, or contemplative studies, or meditation is the best science we have discovered about how to understand reliable knowledge about what happens when we turn inside and close our eyes and feel. Put together, they give us all we need to know about everything. Whether it's an immunization you're going to have, or whether it's what you invest your life savings in, ethically and responsibly. And the way I can put it together is in this Mobius strip, which I'm going to try and do with the microphone in my hand. So, with the Mobius strip, imagine this side, the green side. No, let's do the white side, being the matter, material world of density and mass and speed, things we can measure with a microscope or a telescope. And on the other side of reality, inside, which you can only get through going in, you can't get it ever through measuring things. You can only get it through closing your eyes and feeling what your lived experience of your biology is what consciousness studies trying to understand through various different methods. At all moments, in all things, there are both. At all times. And that means this table here has some form of proto-consciousness, proto-interiority in it. which is a very old position called panpsychism, which is becoming resurgent again because people realize, how can consciousness come from a cold, dead, from a brain from nowhere? So therefore, maybe it's already there somehow, and we just collect a complex system and it becomes super conscious like we are. So with the Mobius strip, what you do is rather than just gluing it here, just before you glue it, you turn it around, and it becomes quite a magical instrument. So these two sides, the interior reality that you experience every day and the exterior reality you see every day, if you put your finger on a Mobius strip and you put your finger on the physical side, this is matter, and you start going around, and then you go around further and you realize suddenly you're on the inside of the strip. And you keep going around, and then you realize you're suddenly on the outside of the strip. And you keep going around on and on forever. What's secondary interesting about the Mobius strip is it also is an infinity sign on its side. This is a really hard thing for mathematics to understand. It's two sides, but it has one side. And that is the best I can get to understanding how our reality works. I don't believe science will ever be able to prove what I'm saying, because it wasn't designed to prove what I'm saying. It was designed to prove one half of what I'm saying, which it can do, and I bring up the evidence in the book. So that is, I believe, what we all are being asked to do, and I believe this is what spiritual atheism is. It's a life philosophy for ourselves to use the best of the scientific world and the best of our inner reality and our inner wisdom. But it's also, as I repeat, it's a way for us to recalibrate our society, which is what gets me out of bed most each morning. So I'll be here at the break if you want to ask any questions. We don't have time for any questions, but I'm sure you have a few. If you don't ask questions tonight, if you go to Facebook and go to Switch On Learning Community, there's a closed Facebook group just for people who've been to one of our workshops or talks. And just post a question on it, and I will answer in the next few days. And we do that so that other people learn from the questions, so it's not just private questions. The book will be out in 2 weeks on Amazonia, and probably some other places too. There's the Mobius strip. You can see it there. If you do buy the book, which I obviously hope you do, and by the way, this is actually we are publishing it as our own imprint, so it's really, we are fully vested in this thing. Please, please, please leave a review. It makes a big difference to a writer on Amazon. Honest review, but please leave a review. Thank you very much for listening.